I think we both got at this topic from different paths, but which crossed in the way. So my interest in Simmel comes from an interest in understanding forms of psychological suffering in contemporary society. So his focus on the notion of neurasthenia as an oscillation between hyperesthesia and anesthesia, urgency and insufficiency, it seems to me very much close and similar to our contemporary experiences of depression and burnout and all the wide range of symptoms that come along with it. So that was my interest in Simmel came from that, from the interest in those kinds of questions and how can we understand this sort of psychological suffering as socially caused and their relationship with the modern economy and the modern organization of society. So that's where I come from, and then, there's a wide interest in this kind of discussion in the contemporary critical theory, and so how can we understand depression, the increase in the rates of depression in contemporary society, and how can we critically assess it? How can we critically assess the processes, the social processes that underlie this sort of dynamics? And I think, Mariana came to those issues from a different standpoint.
Yeah, I was involved in these discussions in critical theory about social pathologies, but it was recently this discussion is taking a path too much focus on a meta-theoretical discussion on what a pathology is and what is its relation to capitalism and so on, but not taking into account the sociological findings and empirical findings that we have about social suffering that people are expressing in many different ways. And so I think we wanted to try, and for critical theory, the dialogue between philosophy and sociology is so important, at least in theory, and we were missing this link. So we wanted to build a platform and invite people to send papers reflecting on both approaches. So how can we connect a more philosophical concept of social pathology with a more sociological and especially relational conception of social suffering and its political implications as well.
And moreover, then while we were interested, I mean, we have been interested in this topic of social suffering, social pathology for quite some time. And while we were dealing with this topic, a lot of things in the world started happening. And we started to see a rise in right-wing populism and even neo-fascist movements, which seemed not only to us, but to a wider audience and to many more people as somehow related to experiences of psychological suffering. Although the link between these forms of psychological suffering and its political articulations and how people articulate these feelings into political stances is not very clear. So we wanted to open the debate on that. How can actually the right-wing movements and also the left-wing movements be understood as articulations, political articulations of certain feelings, certain emotional, which are socially caused. So,
without being afraid to fall into a psychologization of these experiences of suffering, because I think sometimes they're excluded from sociological analysis because they sound too individualistic, but I think the relational perspective can help us to understand that as a social phenomenon and not just an individual psychologized phenomenon.
Yes, and it's also interesting to see how, I mean, this emotional component was taken into account by, for instance, Axel Honneth in his theory of recognition, for instance, in which forms of social struggle were understood as coming from a motivational ground based on experiences of humiliation, disrespect, etc. But this was kind of an optimistic theory, whereas when the path would be from experiences of disrespect to struggles for respect. And what is happening in the world right now is suggesting that there are many other paths from disrespect to something quite different. And so I think it's really important to analyze that and to examine what is happening and to understand political movements not only as forms of rationality, of normativity, but what are the underlying affective grounds. Because my interest in this topic came from an empirical research with shopaholics, so compulsive buyers. And that's where I found Simmel as an interesting author in order to understand this kind of phenomena. So yes, they are a sort of social suffering in the sense that it's psychological suffering that is widespread and socially caused. So of course one can approach that individually, but when it's a growing phenomena, then you can really see, and Simmel helps us to understand in the sense that he precisely highlighted these forms of economic behavior where he highlighted these forms of economic behavior which focus on something which is merely a means, which is money, and transforms it into an end in itself. So in a passage on the psychology of money, he talks about, well, there is the current, the normal, the usual economic path, which is you earn money, you have money, you spend money, you buy something, and you consume that. But you can stop at any of these intermediate steps, and each of these intermediate steps can become a mania, in his words. So eating disorders, compulsive buying,
the eating disorders example is really interesting because first I think it is a social kind of suffering because it is systematic and it affects a certain part of the population, so it's not random, not anyone just suffers from that, so mostly women and so on. And another thing, I think Simmel helps us to understand that because you also have kind of, you don't have only anorexia, but also like binge eating. So you have both sides of neurasthenia, the hyperesthesia and the anesthesia as well, the depression and the burnout. So you have this lack of equilibrium that is part of the modern economy in Simmel's conception. So.
Yeah, and what is interesting, I'm sorry, it's that Simmel, he shows in the case of these specific economic pathologies, we can call them that they relate very deeply, then they reveal the structure of money. So each of these forms of behavior, whether it's the greedy or is the people that spend too much money, they all founded on a peculiar characteristic of money, a peculiar feature of money, which is that it allows, on the one hand, the whole world, it brings access to the whole world. So you have at least potentially the possibility of having everything. On the other hand, you cannot have everything. So it always has this paradoxical characteristic to it. So for instance, the person who only owns a lot of things or who only wants to own money and never spend it, what's the pleasure in that? The pleasure is precisely the pleasure of pure possibility, pure abstract possibility, because if you spend money, then you're gonna get frustrated, probably, in some sense. So if you don't spend it, you might have the sense of this powerfulness, which is at the same time a sense of powerlessness because you're not exerting that power. So this is with regard to economic behavior, but this is not only the structure of money, this is also in many senses the structure of modern society, where we have more and more possibilities which we cannot actually realize. So perhaps that can also be applied to non-economic phenomena, so eating disorders or whatever other disorders. And that shows its social foundation. I think, well, critical theory starts with Horkheimer, Adorno, etc., and has as one of its forefathers Lukács. And Lukács was very much influenced by Simmel. And what happens is that people usually read Lukács's essay on reification, history and class consciousness, but the book presupposed that you had read not only Weber, but Simmel. So what this Lukács's analysis can seem very much abstract when you read it alone, whereas if you read it with Simmel, you realize that there is really a very rich psychological and sociological analysis that is underneath it. So one of the importances of studying Simmel is to really get this more grounded view of economic and modern social life. Moreover, Simmel brings about some elements which didn't come out so explicitly or were even refused in critical theory. So for instance, vitalism. And that kind of perspective was present in Lukács, but was afterwards rejected by himself and by his successors in critical theory. And that might be an interesting contribution to the debate within critical theory.
And the idea of relationality as well, I think, because Arthur started more on Simmel, and I come from critical theory, and sometimes we got talking and we realized we were talking about the same stuff, about the same kind of relation, but he was talking about Simmel and I was talking about Hegel or about the dialectical tradition. And then we started to realize how much that is missing in contemporary critical theory. So that's why I think also, right now I'm translating the essay on Simmel's essay on Hegel about the notion of werden, becoming in English, I think. And it's amazing how it's exactly the kind of the idea of Wechselwirkung and the relationality of phenomena is something that was present, I think, in Lukács and was present still in early critical theory, and it was slowly fading away in a sort of kind of a criticism of too metaphysical, or so trying to do a post-metaphysical science. I think they kind of let go of some important stuff that was central in the beginning, and I think it was related to Simmel.